Well, hello and welcome once again to the DCL podcast, where we're inviting you to sit back, relax, and we'll be on our way shortly. Well, welcome back to the DCL podcast, and today I'm really excited. We've got a special guest, Jeff Curdy. He is an author of numerous books. He's got a new one coming out, which we're going to talk about a little bit about today. He's also been the writer and director of the award-winning documentary, The Sherman Brothers, one of my favorite documentaries. If you haven't seen that, go back and take a look at that. He also worked with Walt Disney Imagineering, and he was the creative director, content consultant, and media producer of the Walt Disney Family Museum. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
How did you get your start with the Disney company, I guess? Did it kind of start when you worked with Imagineering, or where did your...
God. You know what? It started when I was 5 or 6 years old, and I went to see Mary Poppins.
Okay.
And it sort of messed up my brain, and it sort of turned on a switch that started my Disney obsession. I had a wonderful grandmother who encouraged such crazy behavior, and so I just wanted to find out more about Walt Disney, and she was the one who connected me to the fact that the guy who did Mary Poppins and the guy who made Mickey Mouse were the same guy, and that he was a guy. Because, of course, when you're 5, Walt Disney doesn't mean anything. It sounds like a character or a made-up thing. So I just started being sort of a student and a scholar and in all things Disney. And, it was the 60s and 70s, so I would, buy my comic books and watch the Disney TV show. And ultimately, by the time I got to, junior high, high school, I really wanted to work at Disney. The long story short version is I took the direct frontal approach because working for Disney, of course, your outside perception is, artists, animation. So I went to art school long enough to figure out that I kind of sucked at it. But it began to teach me all of these sort of sideline things, or what I perceived as sideline things at the time, but have become very vital and primary, which was, art history, art techniques, background, and mainly putting me in front of artists. And at the same time, to support my art school, I had 2 part-time jobs at live performing arts centers. So I was seeing a lot of theater and meeting a lot of theatrical people, directors, actors, choreographers. So it really widened my perception, too, of what Disney could be. I gave up art school and I decided, what the heck, I'm just going to move to California, try to get a job. Of course, that didn't work out so well.
A lot of people have that idea, don't they?
I finally sort of gave up. About 1983 or so, I just went, it's not going to happen for me. I keep banging my head against a door, and they clearly don't want to open it. I wound up getting a job on the 1984 Arts Festival that was attendant to the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. Skip ahead, short version, after the Olympics, lots of incredibly talented people, particularly on the Arts Festival side, as well as in production and management, out of work. 2 guys over at Disney, new guys, Michael Eisner and Frank Wells, are staffing up and expanding Disney. So a lot of the people I worked with on the Olympics wound up sort of sliding over into this new expanding Disney organization. And after a while, other adventures in between, short and long, I wound up getting hired in late 1986. I really started working in Disney, working with the Disneyland Paris project as an executive assistant coordinator, and then moved over to Walt Disney Imagineering in 1987. Was at Imagineering in the graphics department for a while, based on my highly suspect art school experience. And then moved into the communications office at Imagineering. And that was sort of the transformative event of my Disney career, because I had an incredible boss there. We had Marty Sklar leading Imagineering at the time, and he was very much a mentoring personality when he saw youth enthusiasm and tiny bits of talent all stuck together. And I think a lot of people who worked with him at WDI will back that one up. So I had my boss, Betsy Richmond and Marty Sklar, and they encouraged me to start writing. I was at Imagineering for 4 or 5 years, then moved over into a corporate role in a sort of corporate special projects division. And ultimately, I left Disney because I wanted to do more stuff. I just wanted to do more than the limitations of my job description would allow me. And luckily, I had a vice president that I reported to, and she basically said, go and consult and freelance and see what happens. And if you don't like it or it doesn't work out, come back and we'll find something for you to do. So it was based on that sort of generosity and goodwill and kind of a safety net that, you know, if this new life, this new consultant world doesn't work, you've got a home to come back to. So that was in 1995, and I sort of never looked back after that, and I've never actually really strayed very far from Disney in that time either. But I've gotten to do a whole lot of other stuff, and that began my career writing books, content and culture sort of materials for everything from DVD supplement to documentary films to consulting with filmmakers, exhibit design, and then on to things like the Walt Disney Family Museum, which I did for Walt's daughter and grandson, were my bosses on that one. And that was sort of the magnum opus of a Disney nerd career. And that's sort of my life, my Disney life in a nutshell. I sort of never stopped being interested and sort of academic about the whole thing. So it was balancing my passion for what the Disney culture is with the sort of reality of what the company is, what the studio is, what the product is, and sort of finding a sweet spot in between there. And that sort of led me to where I am today. Got this new book coming out on the 3rd of April, and then another book in September and another book in December. So it's a busy year for books this year.
Yeah, you've had an opportunity to do quite a few different things after you left Disney there and really expand your creativity. And before we talk about the book coming out here, Travels with Walt Disney, a photographic voyage around the world, I one other quick question before we jump into that. Why did you decide to do the documentary on the Sherman Brothers? Did you see that kind of as a void that hadn't been touched yet, or how did you get involved with that?
When I was a kid, of course, I said Mary Poppins was my first movie. And not to go too deep into my peculiar psychology, but I was a pretty lonesome kid. I was a little bit abandoned. And my companions were my Disney junk. And the things that I had that were really special to me were I had the soundtrack vinyl LPs for Mary Poppins, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and the 1973 version of Tom Sawyer. And one day I sort of figured out why I liked that music so much. It was these guys, Richard and Robert Sherman. And the Sherman Brothers sort of acted as emotional surrogates for me when I was a kid, along with Walt Disney. I say frequently the 3 most important adult relationships I had as a child were with Walt and the Sherman Brothers. To skip ahead, I was working probably one of my very first days working over at Disney, and I ran into Richard and Robert Sherman in the parking lot at the studio. And of course, I walked up and said, "Oh my gosh, you're the Sherman Brothers." Well, they weren't used to people recognizing them at all. And we stood and talked for probably half an hour about, mainly I had just seen Tom Sawyer again and realized that they had written the screenplay in addition to the music and lyrics. So we talked a lot and we had a really, really good time. And they gave me their, card and said, "You'd come over and visit at our studio in West Hollywood sometime." Not too long after that, I was going into the front door at Walt Disney Imagineering, where I had started working, and there they were, coming out of the front door at Walt Disney Imagineering. "Hey, there's our Tom Sawyer expert. There's our Sherman Brothers fan." And we once again stand talking for half an hour or so, and I followed up with them and came over and visited them. They would frequently get together and work in the afternoons at their little studio in West Hollywood, and I would come over and just listen and visit and talk. And we became pretty good friends. And after a while, I realized that they were being forgotten. It was the era of Ashman and Menken and the sort of renaissance of the animated feature. And a lot of people in the late 80s and into the early 90s sort of considered Dick and Bob passé. Their time had come and gone. So I started sort of very consciously putting them in front of people again. So I did a lot of things, for instance, with Walt Disney Records. And when I was in corporate with different sorts of events at Disneyland and Walt Disney World, and wherever was possible, I sort of started sticking them into the mix as, doing presentations or events or kind of helping Walt Disney. Walt Disney Records did a big Annette Funicello box set. And of course, nobody can talk more about the Disney Annette Funicello confluence than the Shermans, because they were a big part of it. So we became really very good friends and almost family, like I said. And that followed with a book that I did called Walt's Time that I did with Dick and Bob and Bruce Gordon and David Mumford, which was sort of a scrapbook professional biography. And that came out. And then I got, at some point, a call in 2005, 2006 from Jeff Sherman, who is Bob's son. And Jeff said, I've been talking to my dad and my uncle, and my cousin and I are doing this documentary on Dick and Bob. And they said, you know everything. They said, you know where all the bodies are buried, you know what all the rights issues are, you know what all the photography and film clips and all of that stuff. So I got invited in and was made a producer on the film and a consultant advisor, errand boy, and I brought over boxes of my own collected materials and all that stuff and worked with Greg and Jeff Sherman, who really were the directors, the visionaries behind it. Very interesting. That came out of, to a large degree, the fact that people want to say there had been a rift between Dick and Bob. And I contend that there simply was never much of a connection between their families. But Greg and Jeff were just sort of curious about why their families were not close. And the fact that Jeff and Greg hadn't really known each other growing up and would sort of meet at events and things like that. So they wanted to explore the back history of their dad's relationship and their work and how their work and their relationships and personalities intertwined and that sort of thing. So I happily came on board that. That's when Bob coined another sort of Sherman Brothers word for me and said, Jeff is our resident Shermanologist. So that's on my resume. It's, a Sherman Brothers approved Shermanologist.
Well, it's an amazing documentary, and I really love their music, and I think it speaks a lot that their story has been told and will be out there now forever. Not that their content wasn't already out there, but like you said, making sure that they were known was an important thing, and I want to thank you for doing that.
Well, they were important, and the part of the problem too with so much work, particularly Disney work. Disney work is easy for people to dismiss from a sort of pseudo-intellectual standpoint, as trivial or as childhood toys. It's not real. But you think about the juggernaut of Disney culture and how it's influenced so many lives. And the great failing of the Sherman Brothers canon of work is they made it look easy. And that's a big reason why they weren't getting the kind of presence and respect was, as Bob said, it takes a hell of a lot of work to do something simple. And their songs are so superficially simple feeling. They all have sort of a feel of folk music to a large degree, or sort of songs remembered, because Dick and Bob worked so hard to make them that way. And so very often, as is often the case with terrific works of art, the craft isn't noticed. the thing that was the real tell for for their importance in making the documentary and how people perceive them was we asked dozens and dozens of people to participate in on-camera interviews. And there was only one person who actually turned down the interview. And he basically did it because he had a rule that he did not discuss living composers. And that was just sort of one of his things. He didn't feel comfortable doing that. But we got basically anyone and everyone who had ever worked with Dick and Bob, and so many of their professional peers who spoke so intelligently about what an impact their catalog of music made on the world. That was the really satisfying part. As you said, it's on the record now, and you have the people like Maury Yeston and John Williams and all of the sort of these great musical talents who appeared and performed their music, Debbie Reynolds, Angela Lansbury, Dick Van Dyke, all discussing very intelligently the craft of what they were doing. And that's really, I think, an important story.
Definitely. Well, let's segue into your new book, Travels with Walt Disney: A Photographic Voyage Around the World. And as you said, it's coming out. You'll be able to get it on Amazon. I saw. I've got my advanced copy already ordered. April 3rd.
Yes, April 3rd is the actual street date. Yes.
Okay. And I heard you talk in a different show, kind of the impetus or the story behind why you decided to do this book. And it had to do with a talk that you did on a Disney Cruise Line ship. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and what that was centered around?
Well, this is another long, boring story, so get yourself ready.
All right, I got my coffee.
When Disney went into the cruise industry back in the 90s, I was still in corporate, and they had gotten into a licensing agreement with, I forget what the line was called, but their cut line was the Big Red Boat. I don't remember what the cruise line was. And they recognized that there was like this desire for this vacation option for Disney families or the Disney core market. And that sort of led to the cruise line being created. So I'm stepping way back just because I never, ever thought a cruise was interesting. I thought of, like the sort of stereotyped, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't gamble. And cruises were all sort of like, my perception was the Love Boat mixed with like boring old guys.
I think a lot of us feel that way, or felt that way before you step on that first cruise.
Exactly. So they had to, I had just done, I can't remember what book I had just done, but I remember I was working on 3 different books in support of the animated feature of Atlantis. And I got asked to go on a Disney cruise and sign books and do a presentation. And I could not, I'm like, I'm too busy. I don't have time for a cruise. Cruises are stupid, And of course, I had followed the coverage of the launch of the ships, and I was friends with Roy Edward Disney, and he was very interested in the cruise line and really liked it and all that stuff. So I said, okay, I have to take my laptop with me, and I've got to, have time to work on these books because I'm on deadlines. So I grumbled and groused, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are going, what an idiot. He complained about being sent on a vacation. I had the best time. It was a great experience. I had never really experienced a cruise. And then, of course, you layer on what Disney brought to that experience, and I was hooked. I was completely converted. And luckily, over the years, the cruise has stayed very true to its core audience in terms of the Disney family and the Disney fan. And they've found that they expect a certain amount of Disney content when they go on cruises. So if there are presentations, lectures, signings, events, they got to be really Disney oriented, and they need to have a somewhat higher level of experience because of the higher level of experience on the cruise line. So I got invited back. Inexplicably, I got really good ratings on my first cruise that I grudgingly went on. And they asked me again. And then they asked me again. And I started doing probably one cruise every year. And that's going back, when was the cruise launch? 98?
Yes.
So that's probably a cruise a year since 99, 98, 99. They tend to put me on the cruises with lots of sea days because they really want to fill in content and activity for people who are sort of stuck on board but who are Disney fans. So ultimately, I've done two or three Transcanal cruises and 2 transatlantic cruises now. And I sort of do a lecture series over our, 5 to 8 sea days that we have on those long cruises. And of course, I'm still a big enough nerd to want to just hang out with Disney people and talk Disney and answer questions and sort of be present and do that stuff, as well as the lectures and book signings and stuff. So probably 2 cruises ago, my contacts at Disney Cruise Line Entertainment asked if I would do a new presentation, because I have a bunch of sort of stuff, lectures that are sort of done. So I have sort of a shelf of different presentations and lectures that they can pick from. She said, let's change it up. And I'll do a new one. Of course, I did a new one for Travels with Walt Disney and stuff. So if I have a new project that comes out, I'll do a corresponding presentation and discussion. So they asked me to do one for the transatlantic cruise. They asked me to do one that was about the ports. She said, are there Disney stories for all of our ports? And I looked down the port list and went, yeah, there is actually Disney background and stories for each one of these port cities. Great. So I did that. And then she said, and something else. And I thought, well, I'll just go do a sort of a Disney nautical thing. Maybe it'll be the different, Columbia sailing ship and the Donald Duck cartoon Sea Scouts and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and, stuff that's Disney that's related to sailing and ocean and nautical themes. So I started doing my digging, and this is kind of weird because, of course, I had done the Walt Disney Family Museum, and I have this biography of Walt Disney in my head. But what I had never done was connect all of his travel as sort of one linear item, looking at Walt through the lens of trips. So as I started putting together this presentation about Disney and the sea, I discovered that Walt from the early 1930s on was a cruiser. He went to Europe. He did business travel for trips to Europe. He did pleasure cruises on the old Matson line to Hawaii. First he and Lily, and then he and Lily and Roy and Edna, and then with his daughters in the years up until probably the early 1950s. And then, of course, they talk a lot, for instance, about the Walt and El Grupo trip when he went down to South America. And we've all seen sort of the footage of everyone getting on the plane and going to South America. The other side of the story they never tell is the fact that he was so worn out after the South America trip that they took an 11-day cruise back. So they came back to Los Angeles from that El Grupo trip on a cruise ship. So far from being sort of a grab bag of Disney nautical ideas, this presentation became Walt Disney on the High Seas. And it was all about all of his adventures on cruise ships. And, I stuck in other stuff about, the Columbia sailing ship at Disneyland because it's just a fun story, and about the fact that he just sort of always had this love of the sea. And then, of course, his last family vacation in 1966 was he chartered a yacht up in Canada, and his entire family came with him. It was the one time, his last hurrah, that they all came together, celebrated Walt and Lily's wedding anniversary, and it was his daughters and their husbands and the grandchildren all together on a ship. So I put this presentation together, and it was very successful. People really liked it. And I had one of the passengers come up to me afterwards and said, I wish that I had that presentation in a little book. And of course, the problem on the cruise ships is they don't sell many books because books are heavy and they're hard to store. They're also hard to pack. If you're coming home from a cruise, you don't want a big art book or anything like that. But I thought, gee, that's a good idea. Maybe a little soft cover book based on this presentation, Walt Disney on the High Seas, that could be sold on the cruise ship. So I took my keynote and I made a document out of it, and I sent it to my editor at Disney Editions and said, is there a book in here? And she came back and said, I think there is, but I think you're too limited. She said, if you expand this to being something like a travel journal and you chronicle his whole life as a traveler, I think that it's something that we can not only interest the cruise ship in, but parks and resorts and hotels and a much broader audience beyond just the cruise ship and out into the bookstore and Disney history, Disney Editions Deluxe world. And that's really where the idea came from. But the absolute point of origin is on a Disney cruise.
Kind of thinking back on it, I know trains played a very important part of Walt's life, kind of that travel and maybe getting away from where he grew up. But one of the first big adventures he took was when he went to France in World War I, and that was on a ship. And I kind of think about that as far as, after that, I didn't realize how many cruises he'd been on.
I didn't either. It was amazing. At the time, the director of archives at Disney, I went in and sort of had my first research visit there, and she came and sort of quietly slid me this wonderful document that she had been accumulating for years based on memos and correspondence and bills and desk diary and stuff of all of his travels, hotels that he stayed in, why he was where he was. This was sort of a foundational document for me. Mm-hmm. But you think about a kid from the Midwest. He's there in Kansas City and Marceline and Chicago, which are all great sort of rail locations. I mean, Kansas City still is like the rail hub of the central United States, basically,
Right.
And you think about a kid who lives not far from the train tracks and what the sound of a train whistle must mean. And then, you're at the station and looking at the power of the locomotive and all of the people that come and go and all of that. It must have been highly influential on so many layers of his childhood development. You romantically can sort of portray it as the longing to roam, but I also see it as sort of fixing in his mind this idea of progress and moving forward, not just as a passenger, but trains represented. You think about when Walt was a kid, there were no airplanes. He remembered that he remembered there were 8 automobiles in Marceline where he did a lot of his growing up. Trains were it, apart from, animal transportation. Mm-hmm. Trains really represented sort of the future, and I think set a lot of those other ideas about progress and moving forward through technology into his head. So the fact that he sort of took the train and wound up on that ship to France when he was, 16 years old?
Right.
Was he 15? Did he falsify and he was actually 15, or am I forgetting my Disney history?
I think he was like 16 and he had to be 18 or something like that.
Yeah, there's too much information in my brain. Still, that whole notion, you look at the idea of progress, and then there he is, and there's another form of transportation. Although I think later on he had sort of not so fond memories of that steamer that took him over to Europe, and I think he called it an old cattle boat and talked about that it smelled bad and stuff. But still, memory is memory, whether it's that or something else. It wasn't like he said, "Oh yeah, I think I took a boat." He really had some memories of that whole experience.
The other thing that I kind of took away too is once he started in LA, when he started the studio, his doctor at one point talks to him and says, "You need to take a vacation."
Right.
Because of your stress level. And so
he had a nervous breakdown, basically. I mean, you look at the arc of his career, and there in the early 30s, he had spent since 1923 just so aggressively focused on sinking roots as a filmmaker and as an animator and as a a citizen of Hollywood and in show business. And he really had become what we'd call today a workaholic, in that his entire identity was invested in his work, in his business. And he just, Lily saw it coming, I think. And they wound up taking really their first vacation since their honeymoon in 1925, and went on what she called the gypsy jaunt. And part of it was by train. And then the other part of it was they took a liner to Havana.
Right, to Cuba.
In Cuba in, I think that was 31 or so. But that's also what led him to, to take up polo and all that stuff. It's, we say it very blithely today, oh gosh, get a hobby. But it was really doing him harm. And he found that travel, once again, was sort of a respite. It was interesting. I was just thinking about that trip back from El Grupo and sort of why it was a necessity as well as a transportation convenience. And then later on in his life, you think about it today, we go on the Disney cruise and there we have our internet connection and we're watching TV and news and talking on our cell phones wherever, we can. And he found that the cruise ship was a place where nobody could get at him. If somebody needed him urgently, they had to, send a teletype. I don't even think there was such a thing as sort of a ship-to-shore, telephone at those days. They had to wire or radio him, and there was very little that was of that kind of urgency. It was just, well, you got to wait till Walt comes back. He'll be back on shore in 6 days or whatever it is. So I think that was part of what he appreciated about cruising as well. Nobody could get at him. He could actually just relax and be. And I think that goes all the way back to those early days where the doctor said, Walt, you got to do something other than work.
And I think that's where I was kind of going with that was his chance to unwind because he could get away from people. And I'm kind of thinking about just my own travel and that we have. And in all honesty, still cruising and going on trips with our family, it's kind of the one way where you can disconnect from your life and get away from it and kind of unwind a little bit. But you're right, with the advances of technology now and being able to have internet and Wi-Fi everywhere, it kind of traps you back in a little bit.
And I think that people now are making much more conscious decisions about unplugging when they do vacations, particularly when you're taking your family on a thing like the cruise. The cruise offers those great opportunities to just sort of reconnect and rebond. Mm-hmm. Spouses and children and grandchildren. I mean, we did a cruise for a 50th anniversary for some relatives for my in-laws, and they brought everybody. Mm-hmm. This was their big deal. So there is that desire to reconnect and reunite, and I think a lot of people more and more, even at home though, I think people more and more are going, I'm unplugging for the weekend, I'm not going to that stuff. But I think more than anything, I keep thinking too about the train travel that he did. I mean, he still traveled by train through probably into the 1950s before, airliners became the common means of transportation. And so he had a lot of train trips. They would take the California Limited and go through and then take the 20th Century Limited to New York for business. And that was, probably a 5-day trip at that time. So, he was Walt. He'd take a bag full of screenplays and stuff that he had to read and all that. And he would continue to do that. But it's a different kind of intensity in terms of work in those environments. That's one of the things that's interesting when I go on the cruise ships. I do Q&As after my Walt presentations. And people like myself are still endlessly fascinated by Walt Disney as a person. I mean, who must this guy have been? But one of the questions I get all the time is about the cruise line itself. And it's interesting because it seems to arise organically every time on every trip. There's somebody who raises their hand and says, what do you think Walt would have thought of the cruise line, of the Disney cruise line?
I was going to ask you that same question today.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know what? It's interesting that it just seems to organically always come up. And I think it's because people already know the answer. Because the Disney Cruise Line is such a quintessentially Disney thing. And they work really hard to maintain that sort of effusive, difficult to track, sometimes Disney quality. But, I always feel like Disney quality is really just innate quality and value and uniqueness to the experiences. And so by those levels of merit, I just keep thinking, I think Walt would have loved the cruise line as an adjunct to his beloved Disneyland and his plans for Florida. I just don't think the time was right in the industry, or that it ever sort of crossed their minds that was, because the idea of pleasure cruising was still something apart back in the 60s and when Walt passed away. And I don't think it reached its sort of mainstream. I don't know. You're much more of an expert than I am. But it seems to me it was that era of Princess Cruises and the Love Boat and all of that stuff in the 70s and 80s that really started to mainstream pleasure cruising.
Definitely. It was kind of a mode of, as we've talked about it, as you've talked about, it was really kind of a mode of transportation,
right,
up until the late 50s when the airlines really started being able to handle more people, get you there faster, and then people started resonating towards flying rather than sailing on the ships. And that's when the cruise industry kind of changed and said, okay, well, we need to shift and we'll turn it into pleasure cruising. So yeah, like you said, I just wasn't the right time frame for him necessarily. But it has. I
look at all of the components of what the Disney cruise is and what it does, and what it does in terms of guest experience, and what it does in terms of sort of supporting, promoting, and bringing forward Disney culture. And I just think this is such a Disney thing.
Uh-huh.
It's peculiar because even myself at first, I was like, ugh, cruising, ugh. Drinking, smoking, and gambling. I had all of these sort of false notions. And of course, I wasn't giving Disney enough credit for being imaginative and clever and extraordinarily, still today, the fact that they're 20 years in the cruise business and still maintain such high standards and such great guest satisfaction, I think is a sort of a testament to the fact that they've maintained that sort of Walt originated Disney standard. But I do strongly believe he would have really loved it. And I don't like to do that. A lot of people play what would Walt think and what would Walt have done. And I don't like to play that particular game because I haven't really any idea, even after all the biographical and other work that I've done in terms of examining his history for years and years now. I don't like to second guess Walt, but I look at everything that's contained within the Disney Cruise Line and what it does and how the guests feel about it and think, how could he not have really enjoyed and appreciated and loved this as a Disney business?
So I've got another question too, kind of leaning on your art background, but they use the Art Deco and Art Nouveau, and I'm not the best with art myself, but they kind of use those principles in designing their ships. Why do you think that resonates so much with people? I've been in different ports, and there'll be a Disney ship, and there'll be a Royal Caribbean, and even the people that are on the Royal Caribbean, their eyes just turn to that Disney ship. Why does it resonate so much with people, do you think?
Well, I think that was part of, in the initial designs of the Disney Magic, they went all over the place with what will it look like. And there were very modern interpretations. There were much more, I don't want to say artistic, because I'm not sure that that's the right word, but the design level was much more modernist. Their design level was much more of treating the ship as a piece of art. And I think it was Michael Eisner who circled back around and said, you know what? When I think of Disney and I think of going on a cruise, I want to see a really classic cruise liner. I want to see the Queen Mary. I want to see the Queen Elizabeth. I want to hark back to this idea of the elegance and the romance. And that was where he started to get at it. And that's where I think the answer to your question is. There's something extraordinarily romantic about those days of ocean travel, and to mimic and pay homage to the look of those great liners because that's sort of a Disney thing. You move forward into the future while keeping your roots in your past. It's a legacy issue. A lot of people who are new to Disney think of it as history. But history is data. History is stuff that's back there. History is stuff you look up. Legacy is about taking those things that are in your past and moving them forward. So the principles, the ideas, the basic concepts move into new realms and keep Disney facing forward, and yet there's this rich background to draw on. They did the same thing with the cruise ships. They looked at, why don't cruise ships have round portholes anymore? Why don't they have smokestacks and funnels? Well, they don't have smokestacks and funnels because they don't need them. And that was just sort of a design evolution. So that's why they created, non-functioning elements that hark back to all the way back to the White Star Line at the turn of the 20th century and stuff. So it was, as Disney often does, taking the iconography that touches your nostalgia, touches your sense of romance and going, remember? It's eliciting a feeling. You said it just now. The people from the Royal Caribbean line look over at that Disney ship and it's a whole different experience because it's really reaching out to you on an emotional and a cultural level and saying, remember? And that inspires, like artwork. Artwork elicits an emotional response. And the same thing is true on the interiors of the ships and the decor of the ships. It's to reach out to your sense of nostalgia or elegance or sophistication. The other thing is, I think those approaches treat the passenger, treat the guest with respect. They're not giving you, linoleum corridors with Formica doorways and that sort of stuff, which ultimately says the cost of this was much more important than your experience. So creating the elegance and the level of sophistication in design really says to the guest, we respect your intelligence. We respect your sense of good taste. And I think those are important things that the cruise ships do. And I think that, of course, parks and resorts have done for decades. They speak to their audience and say, you're important. And we get that.
I'm thinking of the thick, rich carpeting that you walk on and the lobbies as you walk into them and kind of the emotional response that it's kind of fun after you've been on the ships before to kind of stand in the lobby and watch people come on and just see their eyes as they first see that and kind of and elicit that response that you're talking about.
You really can stand in the atrium and watch passengers boarding and see the people who have never been on a Disney cruise before. Uh-huh. You can just see it. You look at their faces and go, oh, those are first timers because their faces light up and their eyes go wide and they look up and down and over and around and can barely take it all in. Mm-hmm. But once again, I think that is one of those things that, there's an old story about the famous architect Welton Beckett standing with Walt on Main Street at Disneyland. And Beckett points up to the third story on Main Street and says, God, Walt, you got an awful lot of expensive ornamentation and decorative elements up there that you don't really need. Nobody's ever going to notice it. And Walt said, in standard Walt fashion, yeah, Welton, but they'll notice it if it's not there. And I think that idea goes a lot to, it's not so much that you notice every carpet pile or every lush. How many people walk down the corridors of the cruise line and never really notice that there's a map of the world on the floor and that there's little cruise ships all over that? Probably half the people never even notice it. But it's for the payoff and the pleasure of the people who do, and for the idea that there is so much detail that you can't possibly take it in. That's part of an experience too.
So when's your next cruise then, or do you have one scheduled for this year that you'll be on?
I don't have one this year because of the books coming out, and I'm doing a D23 event in Marceline in May for this book. But I probably should send an email to my friends at the cruise line and see what I can get them interested in. You know what? They always sort of circle around and come to me like I said, about once a year or so. We were just on in last September on a transatlantic and went to, oh my gosh, Barcelona, Lisbon, Punta Delgado, which is where I would like to live for the rest of my life.
Is that in the Azores?
In the Azores.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yes. I didn't want to leave. We were only there for a day, and I was just like, do I have to go? And that's really the great thing too about Disney and this whole book about travels is I had somebody ask me, well, has it inspired you to take your family on trips? And I thought, you know what? Because of the cruise line particularly, but because of my Disney work over the last 25 years or more, I've gotten to go all over the world. I mean, I have been able to take my family to London and Norway and Denmark and Spain and Mexico and Colombia and all over the place, all over the world. That's pretty amazing stuff. And of course, now I'm sure with them bringing 3 new cruise liners online, they probably will have even more need for nerdy Disney guys to get up and yak at people.
Definitely.
So I'm looking forward to filling that need for them at any point that they require me to do.
It's amazing your schedule opens up pretty quickly when they call now compared to that first time, huh?
Isn't it funny how that's the other thing too? People say, oh, you take your kids out of school for 2 weeks. And I'm like, I have yet to hear a teacher say, sitting here in California in a classroom is going to be so much better for them than going to Copenhagen. And this is the thing that's really interesting to me. I realized, the kids don't retain a lot of sort of global information about where we've gone and what we're doing, but it's interesting to listen to them talk in the car sometimes among themselves. They were talking the other day about amusement parks. It was so funny. And they were talking about, Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm. And, it's been a long time since we went to Walt Disney World. I don't remember much of it. And then one of the boys said, I still like Tivoli Gardens best. And they all started talking about, remember that roller coaster that goes like on the roof of that building? Oh, they had the best bumper cars at Tivoli Gardens. I know, chatting on. And I'm like, okay, this is good. This was a good experience. And then, of course, they started talking about Copenhagen and all the bicycles and remember that toy store that was in that little. So a colleague of mine said, what you're doing is you're making them unafraid of the world. I know I grew up in a generation in a sort of a travel mode where I was afraid to travel. The world was sort of a big, scary place. I don't think I got my first passport until I was 30. And yet here's my kids who are 12 and 11 and 9. And they've had passports since they were old enough to have them. And they've been, they're in the back seat talking about Copenhagen. And my colleague said, you're making them worldly young men. You're making them fearless travelers. And that's a huge gift. And once again, that's sort of the gift you owe to. You think of Disney on a lot of levels, culturally, Disney as a point of entry for other subject matters. I learned about Abraham Lincoln because of Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, You think of the cruise line, what a point of entry for learning about the world.
Definitely. Our youngest is just fascinated by Pompeii, and I don't know why, but he read several books this year about Pompeii, and there was an exhibit that came through our local science center up in Portland, and we're taking the Magic this summer through the Mediterranean, and that's his big excitement this summer is to be able to go and visit Pompeii. And you can look at Disney, like you said, in so many different ways, but it's just a great entry point, like you said, to be able to get them to those places and see the world in a whole different view, and a great way to do it too. It's so interesting, especially for people who trivialize Disney as a cultural entity or think that Disney isn't art or that Disney is simplistic or Disney doesn't have meaning. Look at all of the levels and textures and sophistication of what Disney brings through films and television, through music, through these in-person experiences. I just think anybody who has that idea, Disney is just a portal to so many things for people. And I think just like he's talking about ports of call, places to go.
think about being a kid and being fascinated by Pompeii, and you get to, I mean, that's amazing to me.
Yeah.
I'm a bit of a fan. I don't know if you can tell.
I think we all are, and that's why we love talking about it. So I really want to thank you for this book. For those of you out here listening, check it out when it comes available April 3rd. Once again, it's Travels with Walt Disney, a photographic voyage around the world. And it's just amazing the different places that Walt went. I didn't realize, I guess I didn't even realize all the different places that he went. But I think you had kind of an interesting take on how you end this book that I heard. And it kind of ends at Disneyland. Could you kind of discuss that a little bit?
Well, what was interesting to me is, I didn't connect the dots and go, gee, yeah, Walt was a world traveler. And then, of course, at the end of his career, he creates Disneyland, and practically overnight, he actually created, out of orange and walnut groves, a world destination. And suddenly, everybody from around the world wanted to go to Disney. They wanted to go to what Walt had made. And I thought, what an ending for this book, to show this sort of lifetime of travels. And then what he wound up doing as sort of the finale of his career was to invite the world back to see him. And I just thought, you know what, that's just a lovely sort of coda to this whole story of travel. And fortunately, I had just, at the D23 Expo in 2015, they had just done some beautiful new digital scans of a bunch of these sort of Walt with celebrities at Disneyland photography that had never been published before. And I thought that's a fun ending to a really neat story of a world influencer.
Yeah, the pictures are just amazing, the quality of them. And then, like you said, ones that I've never seen before at the end. And what a way to end the story for now, right?
Well, and that's the terrific thing too, is that there it still is, and there it still draws visitors from all over the world to this day, 50 plus years after Walt's passing. So it really is sort of a resonant ending too.
So as we kind of close out here, Jeff, where can people? You said you're going to be in Marceline this summer at the D23 event. Where else can people see you? Hopefully on a cruise sometime soon, but where else can people get in touch with you or see you?
You'll inspire me to send a note to my cruise line people. Although my cruise line people, I do credit and acknowledge in the book, and I sent them each copies of this book as a thank you for the inspiration for having made it. So far, just some local things. I'm doing a signing at Disneyland on April 7th, Saturday, April 7th, and just setting up some signings and events locally in Southern California. But one never knows.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us, Jeff. Your stories are amazing, and I really enjoy your perspective on the cruise line and the Disney company and Walt Disney the man.
I appreciate being asked, and it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart on so many levels, and I love to get people interested and excited about it.
And if you're up for it, I'd love to have you back sometime again, and maybe we can continue this conversation when one of your next books comes out, or just talking about Disney Cruise Line in general.
Perfect. I'd love to.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jeff, and have a great day.
Will do.
Well, that is going to wrap up our show today. I really want to thank Jeff once again for coming on and taking time out of his day to share his knowledge and experience in working with the Walt Disney Cruise Line and just the Walt Disney Company in general. And I really, really enjoyed his perspective on DCL and kind of viewing it from kind of an artistic view as well when you think about the ships and what they mean to all of us who sail on them. We also own several of his books, and they're just kind of amazing works of art that cover all different facets of the Disney Company. You can find them on Amazon, and sometimes you can also find them at your local Barnes & Noble or bookstore as well. And as always, if there are others who you think would enjoy the show, we'd love it if you'd pass it along as well. It helps us grow it and get the word out within the Disney community and the cruising community as well. Between now and then, if you'd like to reach out to Christy and I, you can reach us on Facebook at DCL Podcast. You can also reach me on Twitter at DCL Podcast and Christy at PackYR Pixie Dust on Twitter as well. So if you're heading out on your next adventure between now and our next podcast, all of us here would like to wish you fair winds and safe travels as you head out on your next adventure. Once again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the DCL Podcast.